First of all, let me say very thank you for being here today. I love seeing you all back in class. Thank you for coming online. People who are online, I love that we are doing hybrid things so that if you need to be in the office, that you can be with us, and so thank you very much. Also want to recognize that this is a joint event with our advanced grant, our Meet Your Village series, and that Nas runs here, and through our Build program, through our PMAX events, which Tyra Gross runs here. And then, of course, Miriam is still clean. Okay, so thanks for the grant funding for the food, etc. I'm going to just really quickly introduce our speaker so that we can learn from her. Gianina Baker is the acting director at the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment. She's an assessment specialist with background in minority-serving institutions. Her emphasis has been, I don't know if you've got a chance to listen to our podcast, but her emphasis has been on inclusion and equity. And so what a great person to speak to us then about inclusion and equity as in our courses as we are evaluating our students in this coming back from COVID time. I think Xavier is uniquely positioned to learn from her because I know from conversations we've had, there are concerns about rigor of our courses. At the same time, we are wanting to recognize what students are going through and the compassion that they need and deserve. So I think this is a perfect blend of her expertise with our mission. There's all kinds of things I could say about Dr. Baker. I saw online you were like the Central Illinois Woman of the Year and all kinds of accolades and awards and positions. I sent her bio out to you, so I'm going to leave it there so we can actually turn over to you. Dr. Baker, it was lovely talking to you the first time, and I can't wait to learn from you today.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, if you search the internet, you will find very interesting videos of me. So enjoy. Thank you all for having me today. I do wish we were in person. Personally, I wish I were there because I'm pretty sure you're having much better weather than we're having in Illinois. So I would love to have been in person with all of you. I do want to acknowledge as I sit on at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign campus, it's important that I share our land acknowledgement and that we recognize that we're on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Wiskoten, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. And so, as important as we're having this conversation about equity-minded assessment, that we acknowledge and center our Native peoples and whose lands we sit on. NILOA itself, we are a research and resource development organization, and you can see that we're dedicated to documenting, advocating, facilitating the systematic use of learning outcomes assessment. And we do that through our research and in practice. Many of us are practitioners, and we get to write on that. And I think what's always been a through line is this equity piece, right? And making sure that that lens is applied to all of the work that we're doing, whether that be technical assistance, thought leadership, or so we think we are thought leaders. I'm sure you will tell me if we're not, right? As well as scaling that practice, right? So thinking about this, this is in your own course, right? You're going to have some time to think about your course, your program to the institutional level. We're always trying to help people think about how do you horizontally and vertically integrate assessment practice throughout your entire campus, as well as, thinking about nationally as a whole what we do. Our website is available. We hope that it's much more user-friendly than it has in the past, but all of the information, right, our publications like our occasional papers, assessment and practice, what other institutions are doing to really highlight good assessment practice. If you're like, I don't even know where to start, there's a new to assessment page that has all of the acronyms that we use in assessments, helping you think about writing learning outcomes, thinking about different stakeholder roles and how they play in assessment. So whether that be faculty, students, the board, helping you think through some of those things, as well as maybe you just want to think about general ed and assessment. We provide a lot of resources that we've done, as well as some others in that space, so that you can get what you need and hopefully get back into practicing and using that information to improve your practice. So that's our website. We hope that you'll look through it, lots of time and sweat and a part of that. I also have a role through the Office of Community College Research and Leadership. And within that, we are talking about learning, evaluation, and equitable assessment. And you can see on your screen the 4 pillars that really build out what OCCRL is about: public engagement, equity-driven change, transformative leadership, as well as comprehensive P20 educational pathways. And I think while this information is specific to community colleges, it is not just for community colleges. And I'll share a little bit of that information with you to help you think about how some of the equity conscious, equity minded resources might also help you. So let me just think about this short period of time, what we're going to do. I want to help us define what assessment is. I want to help us reflect on where we were. I want to help us think about where we sit now. And I want you to think about how you move forward in practice. And I shared a Jamboard in the chat earlier, so if you join a little bit later, you won't see it. But I want to make sure that if you're thinking and you want to put it somewhere, right? What is Xavier University doing right now? What are you doing in terms of equity-minded assessment? I believe many of you are. Let's document it. Let's start sharing our practices if we haven't already. And I hope that what I bring up might actually spark something with either something that you've already done or something that you want to implement. And this is a good space to just at least reflect and then think forward. And so as you think through that, right, what have you done, especially over these past 2 years? What is your assessment story? You have one. You might not know what that is, but this is a time to actually reflect on that. And then have that conversation, with what you know now, what would you do differently? We might end up back here again. And what did you learn over these past couple of years that you could easily implement tomorrow if you had to? And if so, are you still doing that? And if not, why not, right? And so I ask these questions because I think an important part of assessment practice is reflection. We ask our students to reflect. It's a great form of authentic assessment. We also have to reflect on our own practices. And so I just invite you for a minute, just to take a look back, right? I don't want to remind you of what's happened, but there's been a lot that's happened to us. A ton. And not just to us, but our students, our friends, our family, our colleagues. There's a clear need for us to refocus. What does all of this mean? How does this impact us, right? It's very easy to say that it doesn't, that it's very much not in our campus environment. But I think all of you would beg to differ, right? And within higher education, you've seen all of these things. I hope these do not bring you PTSD. But we've seen this within our own campuses. We have to take some time to reflect and think about what we're going to do differently. And so as you think about how does assessment even play a role in this, right? Or maybe some of you are like, I still don't even know what assessment is. I'm going to give you our definition. So on your screen shows just a broad definition, incorporating a bunch of really definitions that we use throughout this practice, right? But we say assessment of student learning involves a systematic collection, review, and use of information about educational programs, courses, experiences, undertaken for the purpose of improving student learning and development. We also say it does not mean testing or grading only. It's a discipline and a scholarship, right? There is this field of assessment and it's growing. And it's not only done because someone said we had to. Important points to note. And then within that, right, I think if you are like, that's a big definition, I still don't understand what it means, just look at the visual on the left. You'll see that formula at the top, formula at the bottom, and then the middle is, then a miracle occurs. And it says, I think you should be more explicit here in step 2. What does that, this does a really good job encapsulating assessment, right? We know that we are transforming students. We know how we do that. We just don't, we're not as explicit as we could be about it. And that's when I ask you, what's your assessment story? And this is, while it's specific to the pandemic in that particular question, overall, what is a graduate from your institution? What should they know and be able to do? What is a student from your course? What should they know and be able to do? Are you being very explicit about what that looks like? And if we push even further, right? If we ask about assessment using that definition, right? What does it mean to your institution based on your history, your values, your mission, your educational priorities, and your student population. All of these are incredibly important conversations to have, especially as you're thinking about what's next, right? We prior to, I'd say now, we have tons of conversations about why we're doing it, what's the value and purpose. We should know those now. And there's tons of research and work out there saying that. Now we have to really get to this space of what does it mean to our history, values, mission, right? Our student population. When we start to get there, we really push on what we are talking about in terms of equity. And as we're thinking about systemically, right, we are definitely seeing this movement towards more systematic, aligned approach, where we're supporting students in their learning, both in and out of class. In the pandemic halted some of that out of class learning, but what we're seeing is how important that out of class learning was to our students and how we need to make sure that's an integrated part of that experience. So if you're trying to also figure out, what is equity-minded assessment? What does that even mean? Where does that even come from? We started this national conversation back in 2017. In fact, one of our grad students and our former director wrote a paper around culturally responsive assessment. And you can see the 5 areas that the concepts that make up what we're calling CRA, right? That it's mindful of the student population that it serves, that you're developing and are using tools that are appropriate for different students, that you're using appropriate language for all students when you're developing your learning outcomes, that you're acknowledging student differences in planning phases, as well as being very intentional in using assessment results to improve student learning. Although where students are at the center. Students build out from all of this, right? Or it built out from students, because what we know, and if you read that quote, what is needed is not to help learners conform to the ways of higher ed, thus reinforcing inequities and expectations based on ideologies that students may ascribe to. But instead, we need to empower students for success through intentional efforts to address inequality within our structures, create clear, transparent pathways, and ensure that credits and credentials are awarded by demonstration of learning in whatever form that may take. This paper really did launch and push into spaces that were a bit uncomfortable for people, but really did then they bring out a bunch of examples that people were already doing. So much that we had to have a second paper written. And here we actually push and build off culturally responsive assessment to this equity-minded assessment. That takes in the work of Dr. Stella Bensimon out of USC and thinking about what equity-minded actually is. And then again, that action part is important. And so we say in this paper, again, hearing from the different people involved in the conversations, some equity case studies that are out on our page, that these 6 were important as we move forward with our practice. Number 1, checking biases and asking reflective questions throughout the assessment process. Hopefully that we're then addressing assumptions and our positions of privilege. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Using multiple sources of evidence that's appropriate for students that are being assessed in assessment effort. Number 3, making sure that student perspectives are included and taking action based on those perspectives, right? That we're not just asking students to ask, but we're asking to actually have change happen based off of what they've given us as feedback. Number 4, increasing transparency in assessment results and those actions taken. Number 5, ensuring collected data can be meaningfully disaggregated and interrogated. And lastly, making sure that evidence-based changes that address issues of equity are context-specific. I'll go through each of these. If you want to read more, this paper I think is a really good space to reflect on and give some examples. But I want to really jump in and give some examples that hopefully will get you and again, help you think through, where you sit with your own practice. I think it's important also to make sure that you have a definition of equity. I've done a couple of presentations with some other people around some of this work, and I like, just how simple, right? She defines diversity, equity, inclusion, as well as social justice, and helps us think through, it being a fact versus an action versus an intention. And then really pushes on it and says what social justice here. As we think about equity, right? Fairness and justice for all. And then if we think again about how equity and assessment play a role, right? Assessment, if not done with equity in mind, privileges and validates certain types of learning and evidence of learning over others. And it can hinder validation of multiple means of demonstration and can reinforce within students a false notion that they do not belong in higher ed. That's counter to everything that we want to do within this work. I just give a couple of examples, right, of giving multiple ways of showing what you know and can do, right? The Dance Your PhD, if you've never seen this before, you should, where students take their dissertations and dance and make a dance out of it. Some of these are like some of the most mind-blowing topics, and you're like, how did you figure out a dance for it? But they did. A.D. Carson, Dr. A.D. Carson, he actually developed an album for his dissertation and helped think through, it didn't have to look at the typical lengthy document that is, it makes up a dissertation that many of us did, right? Put it in an album. And why not? When he was in rhetorics, the rhetorics discipline at Clemson, helping us think through how can we again really get to what students know and can do. And then, right, making sure that we start with ourselves. How do our identities shape our approach to data collection and analysis? Whose voices are elevated? What evidence is determined to be valid? Who has a say in the credibility of evidence? And Sal, the student affairs assessment leaders, shared a statement that I'll show just a little bit later. They've talked about this pretty bluntly, like, am I willing to risk my power, privilege, and position to be an ally to people of color? And getting to a place of yes. These are some tough questions that you're not going to get through in a day if you haven't been, actively involved in this work. But you got to start somewhere. And so it's thinking about equitable grading and assessment in your course is definitely a space to sit. But then also thinking about, how do I do this work? Where do I need to be able to do this work? And here's where I think OCCRL does a really good job giving you some resources, right? And talking about how do we become more equity conscious educators. And so here it's discussed that equity-centered reforms and initiatives are often referenced as being equity-minded, but for the most part, that are foremost equity conscious, it moves beyond just the simple awareness of inequities to acknowledging how specific institutional practices may contribute to these inequities. There's a lot of work being done around this space. There's a lot that's happening and that you have to keep up with, right? And it's not, in the work that we're doing, we're saying it's not just enough to just think about, equitable assessment and grading. It really is starting to believe, it's starting to be a part of your system, your values. Otherwise, it's really hard to continue that lens in some of those spaces. The anthology, one of our colleagues at Anthology at the time, they partnered with all of those organizations to help us think through about equity-minded assessment, because while we call it equity-minded assessment, you might have heard of it as something different. And so they did this survey last year and looked at a few different pieces, thinking about, how important is diversity and inclusion in assessment to you. 89% of those said yes, right? I have the necessary background, training, and skills to actually do it. 46 of those respondents said, I feel like I do, right? The majority were like, I'm not ready. And some of it's just the terminology. So you might think, equity-minded assessment is not what I'm doing. Are you doing something maybe that's culturally responsive? And you can see what that looks like there and how we define it, or socially just, or bias-free, anti-racist even. I mean, there are so many ways into this work, and so much to consider as you're really trying to figure out the practices. There's assessment for social justice. There's deconstructed assessment, right, where you're assessing policies, practices, and other social structures to determine if they're perpetuating oppression. Decolonizing. You can see the percentage of respondents who felt like they were doing each of these things. And then there's the 11% they're like, I just don't know what I'm doing. I just want to, if you haven't heard of all of this, I wanted to just at least make you aware, because there is this, again, burgeoning field of all of this work that's happening, and you finding your place and where it makes the most sense to enter, I think is going to be important if you're intentional on making sure that you're really trying to center equity in your course. And so we wrote a book, of course, right? But that's the next step when you get all this information. It's not out yet. It will be out hopefully around May. But we asked all of these scholars and experts and practitioners, how are you reframing assessment to center equity? And we got together a bunch of theories, models, practices together to help us just kind of situate the literature so that you can sit here and then push forward. And in that work, we were able to find a bunch of themes that came out pretty clear to us from all of these different perspectives, right? That there's a respect for place and context, right? Your institution, you're serving students. How are you ensuring that you're serving their needs, right? I think that, again, especially minority serving institutions, especially historically Black colleges and universities, have a real, and tribal colleges and universities have a real respect for place and context, much different from some of our other like predominantly white institutions. And so having that be a part of that philosophy, that context, that assessment story is incredibly important. We also saw from many of these institutions and the work that they're doing, that there's a clear focus on equitable outcomes, and that faculty and staff are crucial to our equity-minded efforts. There's a ton of collaboration across stakeholder groups, right? That it's outcome-driven and guided. There's comprehensive data collection and analysis processes involved. There's respect of student voice. And lastly, that these changes are evidence-informed. And so as you're, again, thinking about what is it that I'm doing, and do you see yourself in this work, right? Are you working to center equity? Are you doing it in perhaps some of these ways? There are a few classroom strategies that we're offering, right? De-identifying the review of culminating assignments. And we talk here about, what type it is, if you think about that terminology. And the strategy that was used specifically was just consciously addressing implicit bias within the assignment. Perhaps you're in your course, you're allowing students multiple ways to demonstrate their learning, right? We are looking at that as culturally responsive assessment. And there's an example in the book about just different ways of thinking about how you actually do allow students to do that. Again, the dissertation that example there, right? You still have that still lengthy document. There's ones now where you can do 3 articles perhaps that are published that could be your dissertation. Again, rapping an album or dancing. What kinds of ways with the students that you're serving, how can you, again, understand what they know and can do? Does it have to be that way that often we learn, or can we incorporate something different? We saw this a lot, assessing their late policy to see if it's affecting some students disproportionately. We understand there has to be standards and expectations, right? Can we think through and look through maybe some disaggregated data to help see if something maybe isn't quite right? Or this is less likely to be seen, but there are some that are creating and revising their course learning outcomes using Lefebvre's medicine wheel taxonomy instead of Bloom's. Bloom's is obviously one of the most commonly used places to help us develop those. Are there some other ways that we can help think about, again, students that we're serving and their learning that's needed? Could we perhaps incorporate some of that? Right here with the medicine wheel, right? They're applying indigenous knowledge systems in their work. And so could that possibly be a way to help us think through our own course learning outcomes and see if there's bias in other pieces? Or perhaps, right, if we're thinking just student services, there's a wellness program that was used at one point to help thinking about assessing bias, or thinking about if you're giving a survey to your students, right? Ensuring that there are high response rates from students. This was particular to a summer orientation program. How are you then thinking about sampling to ensure that you're actually getting, who you need to then make sure that you're getting the feedback that's needed to then be able to make some of those improvements and changes? Or perhaps it's reviewing your financial policies. This is a huge one for our students to see if they're affected disproportionately, or involving students for this particular institution in their weekend leadership retreat, right? How are you involving students, again, in this process? That was a clear theme, again, respecting student voice. And so I asked, I'm going to share a few more resources, but did any of those ring a bell? Did any of those things spark something that you've done within your own course, or something that maybe you want to do? Please start adding that into the Jamboard, because I want to obviously share that with you back. But again, how are you telling your story, what you've done? There's so many ideas in this space. There's so many. I'm sure you could add a few of your own, right? Here, Principles of Universal Design for Learning. If you haven't heard about it, UDL definitely could be a space in which many of you sit, right? You're providing assignments, instructions in writing and verbally. Maybe you're simplifying the navigation of your course within your learning management system. Again, you're giving students choice in how they show their learning. Maybe you're considering alternatives to just multiple choice exams. Thinking about some of these principles and how you maybe have approached effective instructional assessment will be incredibly important in this work. Or perhaps you've thought about different learning modalities, teaching and learning modalities. California State University Northridge talked about, not only all of these different ways that students could learn, but helps you understand how this looks and allows students more transparency into what they're choosing. Are you doing that within your courses? Or are you thinking about how can I ask the right question? There's an article that was written by a Stanford professor where they started out the question, what is the main point of the article that I assigned for the day? And everyone was completely silent because they were trying to they thought there was a right answer, right? And no one wanted to talk because they're like, what if I get it wrong? And so as we're thinking about the students, again, that we're serving and the environment that we're trying to create, he offers a few different questions, right? Maybe I could have asked someone that they might have seen or experienced, or maybe instead they could have write about a concept or a principle. I could write about that on the board and then ask students to suggest examples, right? How are you even setting up the course? How are you allowing for those other ways of learning into your courses? Or perhaps, right, thinking about the syllabus itself. Do you view it more as a contract? I know we've said that forever, right? It is a contract with your student. Could we maybe think of it as a covenant where we're actually learning, engaging, and building trust? And I'll show an example here in a minute. On the left-hand side, we curated a ton of resources that we gathered over the past couple of years, specifically about how you might think through some of these resources within your own courses, or as you're building on your own practice and becoming more equity conscious. Some of these articles and resources will be incredibly important. There's some resources to include in your courses as well. There was a faculty member who actually created their syllabus in a Google Doc that allowed for this exchange between the students and the faculty members. How are you allowing for, again, student perspective within your course? The Hope Center and the hashtag Real College work talks about a basic need security statement. Many of us, I'm sure, have done this, and many of us might not even be comfortable with this. So you really have to make sure that you would be willing to serve as a resource in this way. But, talking about what students and their basic needs are and having them come to you, right, could be a way to start to set up a discussion to allow students into an environment that they may not have experienced before. The Hope Center also talks through, welcome survey text. How do you introduce yourself? How do you set that relationship up front, right? And even give some survey questions that you might give to students to know a little bit about them before they even walk through that door, right? What challenges are you currently facing, or do you anticipate facing this semester? They even go on to give examples of, feedback during the semester. If the student's performing below a C grade level, here's a pretty much text that you can use, and you can insert in those more specific pieces for each student. But, how are you making sure that you're conversating and getting feedback again from your students to know how you need to move forward? Again, this is all thinking about equity-minded assessment, right? Students at the center. When you're designing equitable assessments, are you thinking about, again, the questions that you ask? Why have I chosen this assignment? How does it connect to the different learning outcomes for the course? Does it privilege certain students or abilities over others? Or, are there other ways to assess student learning? And then, are we making sure that we're using open educational resources? I think this was just asking these questions, right? What can I do to promote student learning while we're all still coping within these pandemics? What do I hope students are able to do? What ways can we demonstrate what they know? How can I make it more meaningful and authentic? All of these are just, again, questions to reflect on to ensure that our students are also, understanding what it is that we're asking. I'm loading you up with resources because something's going to stick. Here's one, the Transparency in Learning and Teaching Project. Mary Ann Winkleman's work has been talked about nonstop, right? How do you make sure that your assignments are either that they're more transparent. And she has, examples of more transparent and least transparent. Something to go through, right? To look at the purpose, the task criteria, to ensure that, again, you're being as transparent as you can about what you're wanting your students to know. Tons of examples that are here that I would definitely recommend. And then with that, rubrics, right? How are you making sure that you're sharing them with your students, that you can actively engage them within the process? Rubrics are an excellent way of you thinking about, how do I think about equitable assessment and grading? Rubrics are, if you haven't, thinking about how you might incorporate that. California State University Northridge also offers some resources around equity-minded teaching. And they talk through 5 different dimensions. It's a really long checklist. It's super long, but you can start to think about, do I do this in my class already? Or maybe I sort of do this, or I like to try it, or I'm not even sure this would be appropriate. How can you think about those different dimensions that they offer around incorporating formative assessment, creating transparently designed assignments, right? How can you think through that? This is a great resource to use. For our health professions people, there's a bias checklist that they use to go through their content that I think was really cool. This was upstate New York, I believe. There are so many, all to say, like, there's so many resources that are out here that you should never feel alone in this work. And it's only starting to grow. Iowa State Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching listed all their different assessment methods. Again, this was over the pandemic, but if you're like, I don't know how else to think about this, right? And I've been using multiple choice exams, perhaps some of these ideas might, or that, again, you have some faculty within your own institution that's been thinking about this work. Thinking through the need for it, right? That how these tie back to your learning outcomes is incredibly important. And again, if they're not, making sure that you're being malleable and flexible, right? And making sure that the assessment activity matches up with the learning outcome in the task. That's going to be incredibly important. And we have some really good resources that assist with at least thinking about program theory and implementation fidelity. Otherwise, how do we know what they're doing? And then lastly, disaggregating data. How are you looking at your data, your course outcome data, to actually enhance your teaching practices, right? Disaggregating data unmasks disparities in student learning and informs evidence-based processes of assessment. At one of our colleges here in Illinois, right? They thought and expanded on their definitions of not just age, gender, race, right? But they looked at first gen, how eligible, number of times a student has taken the course. What are some key indicators about your student population that you should be disaggregating and looking at if you're trying to really incorporate equity-driven change? And then making sure that you're not dismissing those ends of one, and not just looking at students of color and white students. Oftentimes that masks those hugely varied experiences within these groups and can further marginalize subgroups of students of color. So this work is personal, right? Assessment is not exempt from being complicit or contributing to oppression. We know that it goes to our students, right? How are we being transparent? Do they even know they learned something? And was it what we intended them to learn? To our faculty, right? Oftentimes we get questions of, why should I be doing this work? What's the purpose of this, right? We have to have some of these questions, these conversations. To systems, right? Are you doing curriculum maps? Are you aware of what's happening? Not just for you, but for your students as well. What comes next? What goes on? How are you being very transparent for students about what it is that they're doing? And making sure that our systems, right, are inside out and not top down. How are we really working to provide, to make our systems transform, especially in this day and age? It's what we wanted, that's what we've needed for quite a while, especially for the students that we're serving. Our institutions often weren't set up for them. So how are we actually really recognizing our situations and hopefully affecting change? A lot of this makes sure that we are moving from institution focused to learner centered. And much of what I just talked through, right, is responsive, it's formative. It's making sure that it's not just my course, right? It's our courses. We are all a part of this, trying to make sure that our graduates, again, no one can do what we want to ensure happens. And that, again, the most important part is the we, right? Assessment, if we just think about it as good questions of teaching and learning, all of these questions we can answer together, right? We're not alone, again, in this work. It might be just our course, but we have to make sure that we are thinking about how students are achieving course and program goals, and how we're using that evidence to strengthen teaching, course design, curriculum, and other aspects, right? How are we really working to build this collaborative culture of evidence and improvement? We'll move on from that, because I think that that's where we end, right? How will you move forward? Who will you partner with to do some of this? Student affairs is a great example. There's so much in the co-curricular spaces where we don't have to consider that we're on this by ourselves, but how are we using them as a part of this work? All to say, what will you continue moving forward? What will you continue? And I'll make sure you get a copy of these slides, because it's a shortened time and it's a lot to handle, but we put together some resources from one of our presentations around equity-centered assessment that will just blow your mind. But I want you to have as much as you can as you think about what's next in this work. And so with that, I'll stop sharing and say, what do you think? What's going on? Questions? I know there's a few minutes before people have to leave.